Okay. Hello. Hi, Alan.
I,
Alan Piper here. I'm going to read your bio here for those of you out there who are not familiar with Alan Piper's work. As a young man, Alan Piper participated in the psychedelic scene in the 1970s and later graduated in the history of ideas in 1986 as a mature student. Since graduation, his interest in the cultural history of psychedelics has led him to speak at various conferences and the publication of several papers. Published papers reflect his special interest in drug-induced altered states in novels and culture of the interwar period. They include Leo Perutz and the Mystery of St. Peter's Snow, The Altered States of David Lindsay, three psychedelic novels of the 1920s, and a 1920s Harvard psychedelic circle with a Mormon connection, peyote use amongst the Harvard aesthetes. He has spoken at various conferences on psychedelics, notably the biannual Breaking Convention conferences at Greenwich University, where in 2015, he spoke on psychedelics, transgression, and the end of history. In 2019, his article, Barak, depicted as Amanita muscaria in the 15th century Timurid illuminated manuscript, was published in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. While maintaining an interest in the current medicalization and commodification of psychedelic drugs, Alan is currently working on various approaches to a deeper understanding of the novels of Hope Mirrlees, author of the 1926 fantasy novel Lud in the Mist. In July 2019, he spoke at the Conference of European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism at the University of Amsterdam on drug states in the novels of David Lindsay and Hope Mirrlees. Apologies to anybody's name I butchered, but that's quite the biography. I just want to say real quick that everything I've read by Alan Piper has been just fascinating. You really know how to take your reader on a wild ride. So thank you. Thank you for being here.
Well, I should say, in case I forget at the end, maybe you might put something up, but quite a few of my papers can be found on the academia.edu website under my name, Alan Pipe, if you look in there. So it's self-explanatory, academia.edu.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been able to catch a few of the Breaking Convention talks that you've given on YouTube. So it's really great when conferences are able to provide those videos for free. One of the reasons why we wanted to have one of these breakout interviews one-on-one for +3 is that your work, Strange Drugs Make for Strange Bedfellows, Ernst Jünger, Albert Hofmann, and the Politics of Psychedelics, this monograph here that you wrote back in 2014, definitely served as a lot of food for thought and inspiration for a piece that I recently produced for Symposia called Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, Psychedelics, and the Right Wing. I thought that your treatment of the question of some of the questions therein were really important. I think needed a broader discussion for those not familiar with this monogram. So for those listeners out there who haven't read Strange Drugs Make for Strange Bedfellows, can you give me just sort of a broad outline of this 50-odd page monograph that you wrote, Alan?
Well, it's a review, I guess, of the connections between right-wing figures that would be typified as right-wing, and overlap between them and psychedelic culture. I guess that's it, in a sense, in a nutshell. It's a long journey, and it was a kind of long journey for me to write it. So, as is the case with much writing, I guess it was an exploratory operation. So as the title suggests, Ernst Jünger, the German author, and Albert Hoffmann form part of the picture, and there's quite a lot about Ernst Jünger. But as well as that, it reviews the sort of intrusion of, I guess, what now you would call the alt-right or the new right into psychedelic culture, and the kind of crossover between the new right and the sort of new age / psychedelic culture.
Yeah, so I mean, in the piece, you spend time, in the brief, like the post-war era, post-World War II era, where Hoffman and Junger form a friendship and actually start tripping together. And
That's right.
I mean, this was some very early stuff. This was would you say the 1950s?
It was. Yes, well, it was in the immediate post-war period.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't remember the exact dates. You've got a copy. I've got a copy here.
Yeah.
Was it? It might have been 51.
That seems to ring a bell.
Yeah.
And so
but
they
were
had
in contact before that. So they
mm-hmm.
met in the immediate post-war period. I mean, Hoffman says, I mean, there's maybe things I didn't include that I can mention, that, he wasn't sure whether Jünger, had survived the war. So, and he was, but he was anxious to get in contact with Jünger, and through contacts in Switzerland, he managed to track him down. And obviously, Jünger had survived the war.
Yeah.
By 1947, they were corresponding, mm-hmm. and Hoffman was sending food parcels to Jünger. Yeah. He was sending him copies of some of the very earliest papers concerning LSD. And so on to Jünger in the late 1940s, when Germany was still in a significant process of recovery, devastated by the war. And it was quite a dangerous place, a dangerous era, in fact, which people don't necessarily realise that that thousands of people died during the post-war period. It didn't all war didn't end, and it was shut up shop. Europe was a dangerous and frightening place for a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, so in this sense, you talk a little bit about how Albert Hoffman was essentially a fan of Jünger's work. He particularly liked the adventurous heart, if I'm correct, and that's sort of the impetus for this pen pal relationship, is that Hoffman was an admirer.
Yes, indeed, Adventurous Heart was where he started. And it was that book, that particular book. I mean, pretty clearly one imagines that Hoffman must have been familiar with other works of Jünger's. He's most famous for this book, Storm of Steel.
Right.
This translation, Storm of Steel, an account of his experiences in the First World War, his experiences of trench warfare in the First World War. That's the book really that Jünger's almost universally sort of famous for, and is part of the kind of controversial nature of Jünger's past. But it was the Adventurous Heart, which is this kind of sequence of kind of dreamlike vignettes, I suppose you would call them, one of which almost amounts to a short story. Some of which are, I mean, Hoffman describes that as if it's all kind of flowers and scents and kind of images of the beauty of nature, but that's really not the case at all if you actually read The Adventurous Heart, because it concerns images of torture and murder and so on. So some of it is quite horrific and terrifying. No doubt reflects some of Jünger's more negative experience with drugs, as well, of course, as the experiences of hand-to-hand warfare. And if you want to get a good picture of Jünger, without a doubt, one wants to go back and read Storm of Steel. But in my opinion, everybody has to form their own opinion, obviously, about an author. Storm of Steel is not particularly, wouldn't focus on sort of the heroism of war and the trauma of war. It does, it's obviously significant. But there are observations by Jünger about kind of natural history the animals, the plants, and so on that he saw in the periods when there was no particular conflict going on. What he was reading. He's reading. I think it's in Storm Brazil. He's reading Tristram Shandy, and he describes himself as a Shandian. By Lawrence Stern, this kind of almost kind of postmodern novel from probably 1700s. Lawrence Stern. Yeah, if you're not familiar with it, anyway, it's an interesting novel and has a very sort of modern, has certain very modern aspects. But anyway, so I think it's wrong to suggest that Storm of Steel was obsessed with the spirit of warfare. That element is there, the trauma and so on as a dramatic experience, which is kind of character forming, I suppose you could call it. That element is there, but it'd be wrong to characterize it as solely of that nature. Because Jünger was an amateur entomologist. He was an amateur naturalist and had a huge collection of insects and so on.
Yeah, I mean, his writing does dwell on the natural world and sort of a visceral experience of humanity and one's external reality. That's one of the things that Hoffman talks about that he likes about Jünger. But whenever I read pieces and everything from articles and biographies to his obituary, everywhere we go with Ernst Jünger, we find this this word that he's controversial. And you said it just a moment ago that Jünger was controversial, and it seems that he was controversial both in his own life and in the evaluation of his contribution to literature and to German culture before the rise of the Nazis. But regardless, he seems to have somehow ended up a celebrated character. But the work that you did in Strange Drugs for Strange make for Strange Bedfellows, I think what was so interesting about it is that you painted a picture of Jünger that I think captured his ambiguity without shying away from the fact that he could be called a fellow traveler with the Nazis. Can we talk a little bit about who Jünger was? Was Jünger a Nazi? What's going on here?
Well, to say someone is a Nazi, I guess formally has to mean that they were, a card-carrying member of the National Socialist Party in Germany, which Jünger was not, and he resisted attempts by the Nazi regime to recruit him as a kind of poster boy, because he was an important, a famous literary figure, before the Second World War. So in that sense, no, he was not a Nazi. But if you look at his history, he was a hero of the First World War. He was honoured for his heroism in the First World War, and in the aftermath of the First World War, you have to remember, of course, as part of Jünger's history, that he was a soldier in 2 wars in which Germany was defeated, and Jünger referred to these events as the catastrophe. And he was an opponent of the Versailles Treaty. He was involved with the Freikorps in the post First World War period. That's to say, these paramilitary groups who were, fighting against communists and such like, street warfare in the aftermath of the First World War. So that is how he emerged from the First World War. He was an opponent of, as I said, saying, of the Versailles Treaty, and he initially saw the rise of Nazism as a good thing. And in interview, I don't remember the title of the book, but by a Frenchman called Hervier, he basically says that he supported the Nazi regime up until about 1938.
Yeah, I found similar references to that.
That occurred before that date. It's after the Night of the Long Knives, when Hitler murdered the sort of the kind of more communist orientated parts of the Nazi movement. And of course, Kristallnacht, when the Jewish shops were destroyed and synagogues were set on fire and so on and so on. So he was, in his own words, a supporter right up really until the beginning of the Second World War. So that is the fact in his own words. Yeah.
And it's not like he then, after these events, he dissociated himself and went to Switzerland or America. He was a member of the Wehrmacht. Am I saying that
Yeah.
right? The German army. He was an army captain,
Yeah.
and he served throughout the war in occupied France.
Mm-hmm.
What was he doing there?
Well, in Paris, as you mentioned, he was involved with censoring letters, wasn't he? So he had something of what you call a sinecure, a task without any great burden, and therefore he was able to spend his spare time, hobnobbing with the literati of Paris, with people such as Jean Cocteau. So probably as a response to the fact of his heroism in the First World War, that he was an important national figure, and so on, he was given a kind of desk job in Paris. He did go out, as a matter of fact, to the Eastern Front for reasons that I don't remember at some point, and witnessed the situation there on the Eastern Front, where Germany was suffering these massive defeats against the Russians. But that's his essential situation, as I understand it, in Paris, or once Paris was occupied. So there's this famous photograph of him marching into Paris on a horse with his squadron or whatever behind him. An interesting thing there, though, is that Jünger is well liked in France. All of his works have been translated into French. He's had literary awards from France, despite the fact that he was part of the occupying Nazi regime during the war.
Yeah, that's definitely complicated. I think, especially for those of us, looking back on this with, this was all before my time. I think it's one of those things where people were, as they are presently, quite complicated. But I think the reason why we're interested in Jünger is that those early sessions, it wasn't simply that. That Hofmann decided that this would be a fun guy to trip with. It seems that Hofmann turned to Jünger for guidance. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's pretty much Hoffmann's own words.
Yeah.
That at an early stage, he realized that as well as having medical potential, as well as maybe giving an potential insight into psychotic states or schizophrenic states, that the LSD opened the doors to other worlds, of which you might say of an esoteric nature. And there's nothing to suggest that Hofmann had any kind of expertise in such matters prior to his discovery of LSD. And he thought that Jünger, basically, according to Hofmann himself, on the basis of his book, The Adventurous Heart, was the right man to guide him through the esoteric realms, as it were, the doors open, the magical or occult worlds to which LSD opened the doors.
Yeah, you talk a little bit about that in Strange Drugs for Strange Bedfellows. You say that Jünger was essentially an occultist, or at least very fascinated by the topic, particularly that form of initiatory. You said esoteric, but that which one must be initiated into some sort of secret knowledge, and a lot of that kind of occultism was going on even in the Nazi Party itself. Can you talk a little bit about Jünger's ideas around these sorts of things?
Well, all I could really say about that is that return again to the adventurous heart. He if you take him at his word in the adventurous heart, and I particularly recommend it as a door, as it were, yes, into Junger's occultism, that he believed that what can I say, that there were realms of that there were hidden masters, yeah, of the world, existing in occult dimensions.
So some kind of ascended masters or secret chiefs would be that
Something of that
realm.
order, but definitely with a rather dark kind of aspect.
Hmm.
Yes. Mm.
Very interesting. So
And just
Jünger,
a political note
yeah.
here: the republication of, or the publication and translation. I mean, almost until maybe 10 years ago, not long before I started writing, very little, writing about Jünger, very little of Jünger's work was available in translation in English. And it is Telos, the publisher,
Okay.
who also publish a journal, who have republished, been responsible significantly for republishing Junger's works. And that's that political kind of aspect, because Telos journal was a kind of, as I understand, kind of Marxist, some kind of orientated journal originally, but now has taken on a more kind of libertarian kind of aspect.
Hmm.
But that's something which I've not explored. But anyone who's interested in figures like Jünger and Carl Schmitt and their significance in the current period would be advised to have a look at Telos and the background to Telos journal. And yeah.
You talk a bit in Strange Drugs about some of the more modern publications and connections. There, you trace a thread from Jünger, who was clearly an ambiguous character, but definitely LSD didn't exactly open the doorways in his mind to turn him into a communist, right? I mean, later in life, he
No.
was still a pretty conservative guy, correct?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he was a member of what is termed, he's seen as a member of what's termed the conservative revolution. And this term, I think it was coined by Armin, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, Mohler, Mohler, who was writing a PhD on these figures. And these were these people who were the resistance in the interwar period, you know, to the Versailles Treaty and to the Republican form of government, democratic form of government that was imposed on Germany post the First World War. And so he was a member of that circle, which involved figures as well, like Carl Schmitt, who now, again, have moved into a position of interest in the academic world, figures who were more or less forgotten probably immediately after the Second World War. And these are figures that, again, that people such as Michael Moynihan will no doubt come back to Moynihan and TIA
Yeah,
journal.
we'll dig into
These are
Moynihan
figures
a
which
little bit.
interest them, these figures from the interwar period, who are referred to as members of the conservative revolution and are still referred to as such afterwards. So Jünger was an important member of this kind of conservative movement that resented the imposition of democracy on Germany after the First World War and the German Democratic Republic that was created by the forced, so to speak, on Germany by the Allies after the Second World War.
Yeah. So I mean that description there, it helps contextualize some of those who sort of accuse Jünger for of creating a lot of the cultural background that helped the Nazi regime gain a foothold, essentially, which is a bit more murky. But I wanted to sort of move into some of the broader topics. Now we have an idea of who Ernst Jünger was, what we can say about him, what his relationship with Albert Hofmann was. You talk about a number of things where when you're you're talking about the intersections between psychedelics and the far right. You introduce this concept of the cultic milieu, and that this concept helps describe where psychedelic culture has typically been situated with regard to mainstream culture. It's changed a lot since then, and how this process makes psychedelia somewhat vulnerable to something you call entryism. So can you talk a little bit about those topics?
Yes, well, this sociologist called Colin Campbell, he coined this term, the cultic milieu, in an essay from 1972, and it kind of describes what encompasses those people who embrace what are essentially fringe ideas, and in his case, essentially those of a kind of religious nature, I suppose, but falling within that, certainly, as he conceived of it, would be interests in alternative health, ufology, earth mysteries, and mysterious origins of mankind, and all those kinds of things. To get a picture of the ideas that are contained, I mean, if you simply go into an occult bookshop, and so over here you've got earth mysteries, over here you have herbology, there you have Sufism, and Buddhism, alternative, Eastern religions. So everything that encompasses, so any individual who you see moving from one stack to the next in an occult bookshop is certainly a member of what Colin Campbell would have described as the cultic milieu. But he was a sociologist, so it wasn't just ideas that he was concerned with, but the sort of the sociology, the social nature of individuals. And he described it as a society of seekers, and that for them that sort of seekership is a way of life. And the individuals within the cultic milieu will move from one set of unorthodox beliefs and obsession might be with one set of unorthodox beliefs, from ufology to earth mysteries, or combining them probably in some way with UFOs traveling along ley lines or whatever it may be. And he described its nature, and I just pulled it out from the book because I wouldn't remember the detail. He says it's composed of loosely structured ephemeral collectives, which would be, the Southern Boston UFO Club or whatever it may be, little societies of individuals who are sharing their beliefs. His members have fluctuating belief systems, are often highly syncretic, so they're drawing other things together, such as I was just suggesting just now, UFOs combined with Earth mysteries, and probably a bit of grail searching added in there somewhere. And there's a continuous formation and collapse of groups of a rudimentary organization. So the little groups of amateur societies with I think that would encompass larger groups as well, maybe things with slightly more formal organization. But he does say it makes low demands on its membership, so you're not required to believe. So although it's called the cultic milieu, it's not describing people who are members of cults as such, but he did describe it as the milieu out of which cults emerge. So you may not be a member of a cult, while you're a member of the cultic milieu, you're one of the society of seekers, but you're probably fertile ground to find yourself.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people might bin some of this
really cultic nature.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. I think a lot of people might bin some of this cultic milieu in with, say, New Age beliefs. All of this has definitely evolved. It continues to evolve. I mean, if we were talking in 2011, we might include Mayan calendar fetishists. So I think I have a good idea of what you're talking about, and I think many people who are interested in psychedelics have wandered into a New Age or a cult bookshop trying to figure out what the heck is going on.
And I would say, but I would say that, you know, that psychedelic culture, prior to the current kind of processes of the sort of commodification and medicalization of psychedelics, that psychedelic culture was, and for that matter, it still is, part of the cultic milieu. Yes. So
what
you
is
will
it?
find, you know, in your occult bookshop, your little section on psychedelics.
So what is it about the cultic milieu that that makes it vulnerable to this strategy that you describe being used? It's not just used by the far right, but you describe it being used by those with far right political beliefs. You describe a strategy called entryism. Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Well, entryism. Now, I had a neat little definition of it somewhere, but it's basically it's engaging with a group of one sort and becoming a member, or getting into communication, associating yourself with a group of one sort with the intention of importing your own political or beliefs, particularly political beliefs. It's associated with. But I think that entryism is significant, and I guess one example is the sort of intrusion, the potential intrusion. I think the fact that, you know, these aspects of the cultic milieu, that it's ephemerality, it's syncretism, the fluctuating belief systems, and so on, and the fact that it's fringe. I mean, the kind of entryism we look at is the entryism of fringe political beliefs. So we're talking about the alt-right or the new right. So because within the existing cultic milieu, I guess, you have this kind of ecologism, kind of back to the land, kind of movements and that sort of thing, organic agriculture and all that. Actually, which one should say that historically, ecology and back to the land movements and all that kind of stuff really has sat within a fairly conservative kind of milieu, certainly in the pre-war period. If you look back to the evolution of, you know, organic agriculture and all that kind of thing in the UK, it's really a rather conservative. Obviously, in a sense, it is backward looking. It's looking backward to sort of rural economies, you know, and agriculture prior to the use of pesticides and chemicals and so on. But anyhow, so it's possible for people to insinuate themselves into one group or another, and with the purpose of promulgating their own ideas. I guess an example would be in neofolk or dark folk musical genre would be an example where so some of the bands within this kind of dark folk, neofolk genre of music are accused of holding fascist or right-wing ideas. So, you know, if you go to a concert of that kind of music, you're really not going to know who amongst these bands maybe hold kind of are proponents of identity politics, I suppose, and so on.
So that piece, I mean, this strange drugs make for strange bedfellows just really grabbed my attention because you know, I have having grown up in Portland, Oregon, and, you know, been essentially like a teen goth. I was exposed to this kind of music in the late 90s, early 2000s. And, you know, it was one of these sort of underground things. There were bands like Death in June or Der Bluthharsh, Current 93. And many of these bands, you know, I learned much later, have just key members who are what we would call crypto fascists. And so, I mean, as somebody who actually now has to go through a process of like evaluating some of this music out there, there's a great neofolk band called Rome that is very open about being explicitly anti-racist and anti this kind of thing, but they like the aesthetic. But yeah, the documenting not only of that as an example of entryism, but you link some of the key figures in Neofolk music who do have these accusations about being fascists surrounding them, following them from place to place, involved in some pretty curious ways with the psychedelic movement itself.
Mm.
Can you talk a little bit about Moynihan and Annabelle Lee and Inner Traditions?
Well, yes. So where did one start? And where did I start? And how did I find myself examining all of this?
I mean, that is a good question. Exactly.
Let's
How
start with
did
blood
you?
axis.
Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah, go
blood
for it.
axis. So
Yeah.
I'm only really familiar with. I think I've probably listened to a few of their albums through streaming. But blood axis. Michael Moynihan and his partner, stroke wife, Annabelle Lee, or Annabelle Moynihan, as she sometimes calls herself, are the key members of Blood Axis, and its name has this sort of suggestion in its own right.
Definitely suggestive.
Of a kind of, what can I say, a kind of fascist kind of, I'm going to say mentality, I can't think quite the right word. But I mean, the cover of one of their albums has this figure on a horse, as I recall it, sort of trampling over corpses, in the aftermath of a battle. Now, Moynihan definitely started out as a person with an interest in neo-fascism, and he edited this collection of these. Well, they were just, what would you call it, Gestetner, these cheaply reproduced pamphlets by this well-known American neo-Nazi, James Mason. And he collected together some of this guy's pamphlets into a book entitled Siege. Now, he probably wishes he'd never done that now, but it's certainly a part of his history.
Yes, Siege is a consequential book in today's far right organizing. I mean, this book is a handbook for extremely violent figures that that essentially, if I'm correct, advocates for a lone wolf style of violent action that is decentralized to bring about their vision of an ethno state or what have you. Is that fair to characterize it as that?
Certainly, those are some of that is more or less the words of Moynihan's own introduction to the writings of Mason. So yes, it's fair to say. Now, I was not aware, to be honest with you, that it's very much still in circulation, or is a kind of handbook for existing, far right. When it's going to be more than far right. I mean, really, these are going to be neo-Nazis.
Yes.
Effectively. So, I mean, we've got Moynihan to thank for that. When there's little doubt that Moynihan has moved on, and he's a no doubt more sophisticated individual, and the work that he produces is more sophisticated. Exactly what his current beliefs are, well, we don't know unless we choose to interview him. And of course, he may not necessarily reveal exactly what those are. But
people are slippery.
But his current journal, TYR, gives, I guess, a good idea of where he stands now, which is looking backwards to figures from that conservative revolution, looking back to figures from the interwar period, who were not necessarily Nazis, but whose philosophies were in some way close to Nazism. But one of the important things about this journal, TIR, is this other issue of reframing, which is kind of allied to entryism, which is to restyle yourself. I mean, Siege is a sort of cheap-looking paperback book, cheaply produced. Mason himself was, just churning them out with a cheap copying machine, and but TIR is kind of high art, a kind of art production, with high quality paper, high quality graphics, and so on, and an academic style of publishing of the papers and so on that he includes in there. But I mean, the last edition that I bought, I don't have that now, I lent it to somebody, but included a paper, now I'm forgetting his name, he recently passed away, but from one of the major figures in of psychedelic movement who was present at Harvard and so on, ended up being interviewed or having an interview published in Tier, and this is where you see some of the crossover between contemporary psychedelic culture and a figure like Moynihan,
was that Ralph Metzner?
Ralph Metzner, yeah, who just recently passed away. Now that interview, and it all gets more and more complicated, and it's a very, very tangled web. The interview was with Carl Abrahamsson, who's a Swedish guy who has various cultural activities. He's a publisher. He's responsible for the publication of Visit to Godenholm, Junger's short novella, and that was translated by Annabel Lee, Moynihan's partner. Now, of course, you mentioned in traditions. Now, I wouldn't recall all the details, but some of them would definitely be in Strange Drugs Make for Strange Bedfellows. But Moynihan was involved with inner traditions in connection with the publication of Julius Evola's work. So
Julius Evola has had some more relevant, contemporary influence in that. I believe it was Steve Bannon who cited Evola as, one of his major influences for, this model for the resurgence of the West. And Steve Bannon, of course, was a key advisor to Donald Trump, and is the president and co-founder, along with Robert Mercer, of Cambridge Analytica, which has been making some mischief both in the elections of the United States and in the UK with of some consequence, with both Brexit and Trump winning those fights. So Evola was an occult figure who was quite fascistic, I think is fair to say. And so Moynihan had published Evola's work in Inner Traditions. Is that what you had said?
He edited, I believe. Edited, yes. Some of his been responsible for editing some of the volumes of Evola's work published by the Inner Traditions. Now, so yes, Evola. So Julius Evola. How do you describe him? He was an occultist, but he was also what I guess would now be called a radical traditionalist and a perennialist, sort of a believer that there's a sort of a lineage of the true esoteric path that goes back into history, into ancient history.
Yeah, Albert Hoffman wrote a book entitled The Perennial, or not Albert Hoffman, Aldous Huxley wrote a book entitled The Perennial Philosophy.
Well, yes, perennialism. I'm really not an expert on perennialism, but that was, so Evola is this curious figure. He actually started out as something of a Dadaist of some kind, and was an artist. But he moved from Dadaism into kind of occultism, and then during the Italian fascist period, yes, he was publishing books about the Aryan warrior and things of that sort, and he was responsible for the Italian edition of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion.
Oh wow!
The key point of reference, really, for Hitler and for anti-Semitism to this date.
To this day, yeah.
This document, which emerged out of Russia, that is the template for the idea of a sort of world Jewish conspiracy, a conspiracy to, I suppose, by the Jews to rule the world, or to manipulate and control world events.
Right, so that's long been inserted on the right. Yeah,
he cozied up to Mussolini. He went to Nazi Germany and lectured to SS officers in Germany on his ideas. but he wasn't that successful. He didn't seem to be taken that seriously. But yes, I mean, why is Evola being taken up, and what is the exact appeal? And the truth is, I couldn't tell you concerning Bannon, and it would be an interesting thing to know exactly what aspects of Evola. But he was, and oddly, he was anti-American. He was anti-capitalist. He was sort of he was against the modern world, which he saw as decadent and corrupt. So there was this intensely conservative view, and he envisaged a kind of esoterically organized society, governed by either a race, an elite of warriors or an elite of priests. Was his conception of how society should be organized. He was certainly an anti-Semite, yes,
Evola,
his books need to be read. The video of that you sent me the link to.
ContraPoints.
He talked about the use of codes and so on. So
Yeah.
you have to read between the lines with an individual like Evola, and between the same applies to the kind of introductions to Evola's books. So if Evola talks about the bourgeoisie, he's probably talking about the Jews,
right? So just for those of you following along, I sent Alan a video of ContraPoints decoding the alt-right, because I thought that it might be interesting to have him comments or just have some common ground in terms of talking about how other folks have looked at the topic of entryism in the far right. With regard to just briefly with Annabelle Lee, one of the things that really struck me about her work as a translator is that she translated one of my favorite books. I'm a plant scientist, or at least that's my training, and she translated the Encyclopedia of Psychoactive Plants by a Christian, I always mispronounce the name, but Ratched.
Right.
It's a fabulous book, but I mean, there's just all of this incongruity, that was one of the things that both struck me about how detailed you went into establishing that these individuals had affiliated themselves more or less with the far right, but also really seemed to have quite an enthusiasm for psychedelia, both in culture and in practice. Evola too seems to be somebody who also embraced the use of drugs, and so in doing so, I saw you really just draw this line, because they themselves, I think, seem to hearken back to Jünger and some of his associates. Is that correct?
What, the Moynihan's you're talking about?
Yeah.
Well, certainly there'd be admirers of Jünger, and I mean, Annabelle Lee translated this visit to Goldenholm, this key work, which is a fascinating work because it draws on Jünger, draws on his LSD experiences with Hofmann, he was his tripping companion, in the descriptions of events in Visit to Goldenholm, and it also is a picture of Junger's sort of esoteric worldview, one involving hidden masters who can offer some specific form of enlightenment to their students.
So when you were writing this work, can you tell me? I want to talk a little bit about your process. So, I mean, first of all, what exactly first sent you on this journey, this particular journey? Were you just noticing these things? But I mean, how did you make the connections that seem to be, knitted together in such a great way?
I thought to myself when I was thinking about it, the truth is I cannot really remember exactly or really what motivated me to start work on Strange Drugs Make for Strange Bedfellows. But my kind of suspicions or uncertainty about the New Age necessarily being something that espoused liberal values goes back a very long way to a copy which I mentioned of a journal called Co-Evolution Quarterly, which was a kind of a whole earth catalogue type of, back to the land ecological journal from the 60s, early 70s. And in Co-Evolution Quarterly, there was I think it was 2 or 3 part article about the Volkish movements in starting around the turn of the century, which were these kind of romantic back to the land movement. Volkish in German simply means folkish, so if you see photographs or pictures of members of the Volkish movement, they look very much like the hippies of the 60s. They're dressed in, some of them dressed in medieval clothing or simple kind of peasant kind of clothing. They're strumming their guitars and walking down country lanes, singing folk songs. So there was this kind of back to the land, back to an idealization of a simple rural economy, and obviously it had a nationalistic kind of element as well. So there are plenty of studies of the Volkish movement that see that as not being the origins of Nazism, but being part of the some of the aesthetics of Nazism. And of course, Nazism did embrace things like organic agriculture and such like. And anyway, it was asking the question, I can't remember exactly the year, but in the late 60s, early 70s, was there a possibility that the hippie movement could move towards some kind of fascistic kind of movement? And of course it didn't. And that was unlikely, because this was just an element. But it was this kind of this element of kind of mystical nationalism of fair-haired maidens and so on. Anyhow, that was something I never forgot, having read about that. Yeah. But also, I was reading Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh's lectures.
Oh yeah.
Avidly at that time. So it would have been my very early 20s.
Any comments on the Wild Country treatment of Rajneesh? Were they a group that used psychedelics?
Sorry?
Were the Rajneeshis using psychedelics?
I've not investigated that. I believe they were using MDMA. I seem to remember hearing that Rajneesh got into nitrous oxide. And made some remarks to the effect that, God, if I'd only known about nitrous oxide years ago, I wouldn't have bothered with all that meditation. But anyhow, but Rajneesh made these curious remarks about the Nazis and about Hitler originally being the tool of some esoteric group who were trying to save the world.
The secret chiefs, huh?
And I never forgot that, and left me with a bit of an abiding suspicion about the potential. Of course, I've not watched Wild Country, but things did not go so good for the Rajneesh group. And of course, you might argue that it simply did become an authoritarian cult. And so I think that although the hippie movement did not give rise to some kind of fascism, obviously a lot of people who did psychedelic drugs and so on in the 60s and early 70s did move on into cults of an authoritarian nature. And certainly LSD didn't inure them or protect them against finding themselves in authoritarian cults of religious cults of one sort or another.
So psychedelics are not an antidote.
Or political ones, such as the Weathermen,
So you would not say that psychedelics are an antidote to authoritarianism?
I don't think there's any reason at all to think that. Certainly not an antidote. Well, no, not to authoritarianism, and certainly it's not going to cause you to have necessarily liberal political values. I mentioned to you previously in conversation, I don't think it's something that I go into in Strange Drugs Make for Strange Bedfellows, but there's the Henry Luce, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and his wife, who was an ambassador to Italy.
Henry Luce being with Time magazine, right?
Yes,
Time
yes.
Life.
Yeah, the founder, I believe, of Time Life and so on. And he and his wife were virulent anti-communists, in that post-war period during the Red Scare, what sometimes called the Second Red Scare. the first being, post the Russian Revolution, and McCarthyism and so on, and they were virulent anti-communists, himself and his wife, and they took LSD under Sidney Cohen, and there's no evidence to suggest that it changed their political views. LSD is a drug which gives you a sensation of insight, isn't it? That's
yeah.
I sometimes think to myself, well, it's a drug which gives you a sensation of insight, but to what extent it actually gives you insight is another is another question.
Many people have puzzled over that question.
But I mean, my view is it's a bit of an accident of history that that LSD is associated with the counterculture. I think that it was what I described in one of my presentations at Breaking Convention at Greenwich University. It was useful as a technology of resistance, and no one can doubt that there has this kind of what you might call deprogramming kind of aspect, and strip you of your kind of preconceptions. And just to give a strange example of my own experience, I remember I was tripping once, or sort of in the aftermath of a trip as a young man, and I saw someone walking down the street with this creature on a bit of string, and they both seemed so pleased with this arrangement. And of course, it was a human with a dog. I thought, what is that? And it was that they both seemed so happy. I thought, what is that? With this arrangement, and you just had a sudden, a glimpse of it, something in a way that you never question. Well, people have dogs, people have pets.
Yeah.
But it just struck me the strangeness of that arrangement. But yes, so it stripped away those things. But why that should then cause you to adopt kind of liberal values, I see that as a kind of accident of history. It worked. I see LSD as one of its principal effects being to disrupt normal processes of perception,
Mm-hmm.
and
I mean, I think
release
many would
the
say,
reins, as it were. I'm not a fan of this kind of what do they call it, Huxley's idea, but it just loosens the processes of perception until you're kind of aware of them yourself, or one of the effects. But it disrupts. It's disruptive, and it's potentially socially disruptive, which is why I think it will never be made available to the masses.
So, I mean, that's something that, I mean, this idea, though, it certainly is floating around there. And I mean, I would say that the work of Catherine McLean and the Hopkins team on psilocybin and openness, and also some of the studies on people with psychedelic experience being more tuned into nature, along with the Carhart-Harris paper, where they make a case that some medical intervention, at least for treatment-resistant depression, can reduce one's self-reported scores for authoritarianism. And I mean, all of these studies are based on relatively few subjects. I think most people feel intuitively, at least, the openness research, probably from their own experiences. Some of the others may be selection bias, although if you're more likely to eat some weird mushrooms, you also might be more likely to go hiking. But I think these three studies in particular, that and the association with a sort of unruly period in American and European history that was also coinciding with psychedelic use, has really brought forth this idea that psychedelic use, particularly within the psychedelic community, are going to sort of usher one along the way towards more liberal views. And I explored this in Lucy in the Sky with Nazis, a lot of pushback on some aspects of it. Others, reviewed it fairly positively. But I think, the cases that you point to in Strange Drugs Make for Strange Bedfellows, and then the more recent cases of, violent, presumably violent planning. Some of them had already committed acts of violence. Neo-Nazis also, in possession of or apparent consumption of psychedelic substances like mushrooms and DMT. I just feel like that is a fiction that can no longer really be held. And I think it's something where, as we go into medicalization and even decriminalization, some people may be somewhat surprised. And you talk about this towards the end of Strange Bedfellows. They may be surprised that their affection for these substances may be shared with people that they don't share any other belief with.
Well,
I
think that's the case. I think that's the case, and some of the material which I'm not familiar with that's in your piece, Lucy, in the Sky with Nazis, brings these points up to date. I take it up to that point to really the publication of Tear journal by Michael Moynihan and so on, and their kind of reframing of sort of radical traditionalism, or reframing of alt-right ideas and putting them into a kind of sophisticated journal and so on. But I think that things that you refer to bring it even further up to date with the reference to these characters like Joe Rogan and such like, who I'm really not familiar with, and it's not my not my cup of tea, not something I spend my time really studying or looking into. But
he's quite influential, and to clarify once again, Joe Rogan identifies much more as an American libertarian. I know over in the EU, the libertarianism is practically synonymous with socialism. Joe Rogan is definitely not a socialist. But yeah, if he is not, somebody who is on the right himself, he sure is and has been chummy with individuals who are. Many of whom were amongst the leading voices of the alt-right, in the last decade or so. So in any case, I mean, we don't need to talk too much about individuals you're not particularly familiar with, and I can't say I would recommend too much of those characters. But I wanted to just touch on, it seems inevitable that decriminalization efforts are going to continue. Medicalization, perhaps some form of commercialization of some psychedelics may occur. How, given all that we know about these things not having some sort of prescribed outcome, how do you see us as a culture reevaluating the place of psychedelics, as it seems there is a renewed interest in them?
Well, as someone who himself associated psychedelics with with the sort of new age and with the counterculture in my own experience, I have very little enthusiasm for the sort of medicalization. Not obviously, if substances such as MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder are going to benefit individuals, or for that matter, LSD in terms of things such as addiction, or trauma for that matter. Well, obviously that's essentially a good thing, at least for those individuals concerned. I'd rather suspect that psychedelic therapy is going to be the reserve of the white middle classes. This is not something that's going to socially benefit the dispossessed, the poor, the disenfranchised, society needs to change in that respect, in terms of the redistribution of wealth. Essentially, if that's the way that one looks at things. So I don't have a lot of optimism that it's something that's going to benefit society in general. When they were medically available previously, it was certainly the preserve of the wealthy and the middle classes seeking to resolve their neuroses. It's not going to be much use to you if you live in the ghetto. It's not going to solve your problems. So that is my skepticism, really, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, and Big Pharma will do what Big Pharma does once it gets its hands on them, which is to market it for the best price and and probably regardless of the consequences.
Sure. It's always struck me as somewhat ironic because in the underground, in nature, mushrooms in particular, they grow without anybody intervening at all, and now one can fly to the Netherlands and spend several $1,000s to take something that if you were in the parking lot of a jam band show might cost you $15, and I think it's really sort of a testament to you having a pretty good understanding of what's going on culturally and with psychedelics. In your recent analysis, it reminds me of a comment that was made to Neil Goldsmith at Horizons during this economic expansions panel, Horizons Perspectives on Psychedelics, last October, where a harm reduction activist, someone who works for the public health department in New York on overdose prevention, a woman named Yerlix Estrada, came up to the mic questioning Goldsmith, saying Goldsmith's the CEO and co-founder of Compass Pathways, would like to patent psilocybin, has put in a patent in the UK, and Estrada says, people of color don't have access to therapy, let alone psychedelic therapy. So how is this all going to work? And what you just articulated is that is how it is likely to work, that it will be useful medicine. Don't get me wrong, and I don't want to get you wrong, but certainly not for everybody, at least if not without massive changes in terms of, as you said, the redistribution of wealth in society. And I just think that's something that we need to take a hard look at, which is that if our goal is the access of these rarefied states to those who want or need them, we're not really just going to get there by accident. We probably need to do other work that has nothing to do with taking drugs. Does that sound accurate to you?
What would that other work be then?
Organizing
political and social action.
Yeah. Well,
indeed. I mean, assuming things do proceed along the lines that we've just discussed, then there will still be a psychedelic underground. Those who wish to take them recreationally, or for sort of philosophical reasons, you might say, to investigate the nature of consciousness and so on, will continue to do that underground. I think that I just don't think that you're going to see decriminalisation. I know there's decriminalisation of mushrooms. I suspect in some ways that there's an awareness on the part of the authorities it's extremely difficult to stop people growing their own, and so on. So there's little to be gained in attempting to regulate them. But LSD, and other pure chemicals, because they're simply so powerful, and in large doses are simply so mentally, one might say, deranging, that I don't think they're going to allow those out for the use of the hoi polloi any more than, you know, that a drug for the treatment of cancer would be given out to everybody. I think that the most powerful ones will remain regulated, because they're seen as potentially injurious in case of injudicious or unqualified use. You know.
Mm-hmm. Well, ultimately, we'll see. It seems that quite a bit of change has happened on the topic when many said it wouldn't for another decade or ever. So, I mean, really, we don't know what's going to happen, but I think it's important to point out that there are, you know, multiple potential outcomes.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right.
That if we prefer one or the other, we probably should advocate for it and not pretend like these substances are going to, you know, open everybody's third eye to universal health care or what have you. So they're not going to end wars on their own. At least I don't see evidence for that. It would be great if there were such a thing. Don't get me wrong. But it just doesn't seem.
Can you give a vision of some sort, Brian, of how you would like to see things proceed, given the current situation as we see? We've got the decriminalisation of marijuana going on,
right,
and in some cases of psilocybin mushrooms, and then you've got this medicalisation, and now, of course, you know, it's being depicted as an investment opportunity.
Yeah. So this is something that, you know, we've thought and discussed quite a bit at symposia and on +3. Generally speaking, I think the tried and true policy model that exists in the European Union is Portugal. You know, Portugal decriminalized all substances. They did not legalize all substances. They decriminalized them, and that was coupled with a number of harm reduction and education efforts. And I think that, you know, the fact that this did not necessarily, you know, cause an explosion of addiction, we didn't see the kinds of, you know, things that the pearl clutching prohibitionists say would happen. Well, you know, Portugal's still there. It's still a functioning country. And in fact, the whole decriminalization that happened in Portugal was in response to an opioid crisis that the United States is currently gripped in. I'm in Ohio. We're ground zero for this sort of thing. So, I mean, I see decriminalization as smart public health policy when it is coupled with other public health policies, such as education and harm reduction, and just robust, you know, civil and social security. So, you know, I mean, I see the drug war as a lens to see a lot of, you know, imperial and power relationships. It's a way that, you know, people in the United States have allowed themselves to become the most policed and incarcerated nation on the face of the planet, and it's allowed for quite a bit of, you know, rhetorical backing for the intervention and invasion in other countries and the affairs of society.
Well, indeed, it's a worldwide picture.
Yeah.
But funnily enough, what you're just saying there rouses in my mind a question I was about to put to you a little bit earlier, which is, in the case of Portugal, you have to consider, not that I know what it is, but the nature of Portuguese society. It's a smallish nation. I think it still has quite a rural economy. I mean, I've been to Lisbon a couple of times. It's a very different country, obviously, to the States. It's not to say you might not,
Yeah, definitely. And I
might
mean,
not resemble some US states,
yeah,
but I'm wondering in that situation that whether what worked in Portugal would work. I mean, you've just been talking about America as a kind of a police state,
yeah,
and
it's a fair characterization. So, I mean,
and
actually, the question that you're asking is often, brought up whenever anyone, particularly somebody like Bernie Sanders, tries to say we should do, say, Nordic models of socialism in America, and everyone always says, well, that's a very small country. Even the Canadian healthcare system, they say, well, yeah, but that's only 11 million people. And, I think that it's important to state what your goals are. I mean, I would like to live in a world where, my children are not subject to, random arrest and search and seizure because of the chemicals they choose to alter their consciousness with. I think that's, a pretty simple statement. But in terms of, what all that looks like, I mean, I think that there's all kinds of ways that these things can be rolled out in such a way that there's time to adapt. I think they can be sort of fine-tuned for whatever local conditions there are. Certainly, any of these strategies that require things like harm reduction and education would require funding. But when you compare that funding to what we've given to absolutely useless in terms of effects, eradication efforts, like we have plenty of data about the war on drugs. Drugs a long time ago. And so, we at Symposia are advocating for something different. We'd like to see a world where, decriminalization, not necessarily a medicalized or even a legal market. I'm not sure I would be able to keep my lunch in my stomach if I saw a billboard advocating for, orange flavored LSD. So I guess that's more or less what we're thinking about, and I think that each state region probably would require some kind of fine tuning because local conditions are local conditions. But I don't think it's something that we should tell ourselves is impossible. The reality is that with climate change, with all of the issues that face us as a global society, the crumbling of capitalism, which seems to be imminent, maybe not in my lifetime, but it seems to be happening. I'm not sure, crossing fingers. We're going to have to revision society. And in some ways, maybe psychedelics could play a role in that. But no more than any other kind of cognitive tool like meditation. So I mean that's generally where I fall with these kinds of things. So, but I think that your analysis in strange drugs, it really caused me to think, and it essentially opened Lucy in the Sky with Nazis with this thought, which is that people who really want to see psychedelic drugs play a role in changing the world in some specific way probably need to take a hard look at that assumption and maybe just figure out what other steps might be important. It probably seems silly to those outside of the psychedelic community that has to be stated, but unfortunately, due to the exuberance of a lot of press that we've seen, it does have to be stated. So, so thank you for the work that you've done, and thank you for spending some time with us, so that other folks who haven't had a chance to read your work have an idea of what you've been researching and talking about.
Well, thanks for your time as well, Brian, and for inviting me to begin taking an interest in my work. There's at least I know it hasn't sunk without trace
Far from it. And I mean,
and
as I said to everyone at the beginning, do check out Alan Piper's other work. It's really fascinating stuff. Haven't read anything so far that I haven't just thoroughly enjoyed. So
well,
thanks for your work, Alan. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on.
sure, my pleasure,
Plus Three.
Brian.
All right.
Great to chat with you.
Well, we'll call it a wrap there.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks everybody for listening. Thank you, Alan.